Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks, August 8th, 2016. As promised, we are going to talk about some domestic issues tonight. We're going to talk about some solutions. We're also going to talk about some natural health issues. Talk about a lot of different things. We need to touch on the Zika virus, since that is becoming something that is, concerning to many people if you're watching the mainstream media. Then we'll address that tonight. I want to draw your attention to the fact that I have done one interview. There's been somewhat of a hiatus on the interviews that I've been doing, but I did pop into Before the First Cup with Jules here on UCY, and that archive is, of course, on her page, but it's on my website, BrandonTurbeville.com, as well, and you can listen to it there on the YouTube recording or the MP3 player. So that's archived there. We talk about many of the subjects that I'll talk about tonight. Now, for those of you who are just joining us for the first time tonight, I'd like to encourage you to catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's when the show is aired for the first time during the week. The show is being recorded the day before, of course, so if you're listening to this, the show was recorded yesterday, Sunday, August 7th. We do that in order to, to try to get as close to the air date as we can, but sometimes logistics prevent us from doing that. So if you're interested in my work, activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, eraofwisdom.org, you can go check those out there. And also, if you're interested in my work specifically, then I highly encourage you to go to BrandonTurbeville.com. That is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the relevant information there. The books are there. The contact information is there. The PDF version of 36 Reasons Hillary Clinton Should Never Be President. Actually, the full title is The Difference It Makes, 36 Reasons Why Hillary Clinton Should Never Be President. One of my books is available. You can buy that hard copy in the bookstore, or you can download the free PDF, and you can read it, you can share it, you can give it away, you can do whatever you like with it. So please do so. It's imperative that Hillary Clinton is never president. Of course, I should mention this is not an endorsement of Donald Trump. This is an attempt to prevent Hillary Clinton from being president. So we're not voting for Trump, but we're certainly not voting for Hillary. And there's a reason for that strategically, and perhaps we'll get a chance to look into that. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that a real New Deal for America, 43 points. This is the 43-point manifesto, I guess we should say, that I have been talking about for some time since it was posted. And the positions in the 43 points are not in total, right? These are a summary of points that I put out. The reason it is now posted, permanently on the website, over in the right-hand side of the website in a window, is because of the rather large reception we got to it. And I didn't want it to be something that kind of disappears. You have to do a Google search for it, disappears into the site. I wanted to keep it up there because we've had such a good response to these 43 points, and we're going to continue to hammer these 43 points home as we move forward. So maybe we'll get a chance to discuss them more tonight. They're essentially marching orders. Now, I do want to start with the Syrian crisis and move back over to Western Europe and then back further to the United States. And I think one of the things I want to point out here is the Aleppo situation in Syria. The city has been effectively encircled by the Syrian military, and the encirclement is the result of years of heavy fighting between the Syrian military and the Western-backed terrorists who managed to control a portion of the city and hold it for the majority of the crisis. The Syrian military, of course, has fought long and hard to retake the city. There's been a number of failed attempts Even recently, in the recent months, there's been a few failed attempts to really retake the city, or at least encircle the city. And they've clinched several important strategic sites now that would allow them to surround the city over the course of the war. So over the last week, the Syrian military finally clinched the encirclement of Aleppo. We expected this, and it did happen, that the terrorists launched a massive counterattack, but they were repelled after suffering heavy losses. Some of our sources put the number of dead terrorists at around 800 from this operation alone. So subsequently, the counterattack was abandoned, and the terrorist forces located inside the city are now essentially cut off from supply lines and support of their terrorist brethren. So as long as any further attempts to break the siege of Aleppo will fail, then it's clear that the terrorist days are numbered, at least the ones that are in Aleppo. If there's another counterattack, and we do assume that there will be, then the Syrian military has to hold the line long enough until the counterattack is repelled before they move to retake Aleppo. They need to reinforce those lines to make sure that the siege cannot be broken. Now, unfortunately, terrorists have a massive presence in the area surrounding Aleppo, and the possibility of a major counterattack to break the encirclement is very real. The Russians have been dropping an immense amount of bombs and missiles in the area. They've had airstrikes taking place almost by the minute in order to prevent a successful counterattack. Al-Masdar has reported that there are nearly 8,000 terrorist fighters ready to launch an assault on Aleppo. We hope there's we hope there's less now after the Russian bombings. And of course, the Russian bombing played a major role in the ability of the Syrian military to encircle Aleppo in the first place. There's again an immense amount of bombs that were dropped during the siege. So even if the siege is broken and the terrorists are able to open up Aleppo, they are going to be welcomed by a rather large contingent of the Syrian military, of Hezbollah, of Palestinian forces, of Iranian forces. So that's what is going to be welcoming them. But we hope that the Syrian military is able to hold these lines. The coming days are going to be the biggest test. In fact, I would say this week has been the biggest test. And as we move on through time, it's going to be less likely that these terrorists are able to break the siege unless they're planning some massive counterattack. So we would imagine that the Syrian military has strategic plans to not only siege Aleppo and retake rebel-held areas of Aleppo, but also to bring out some kind of attack on the areas surrounding the recently captured areas, the areas where these 8,000 terrorists are at. We imagine and hope that the Syrian military has a plan to deactivate these terrorist supply lines, some type of pincer movement to encircle them, perhaps, or the airstrikes maybe continuing until each one of these terrorists are dead, or at least weakened, attenuated to the point that they can't break the Syrian siege. So that is a bit of good news that we have on the Syrian front, is that Aleppo is now encircled. And if things continue apace, then Aleppo will be retaken, and that will be one of the biggest strategic victories of the Syrian military in 2016. Certainly have an effect in terms of public relations, morale, and it will have an effect in terms of strategy. Aleppo's the biggest city in Syria. It can't have terrorist rats in it, infesting it. So we have some other news, some more good news. Now, of course, we want to preface this by saying war is never good news, but it's often good news when the person who starts it with aggression is dealt with in the same manner. So as we have the war in Syria raging, and the American elections and terrorist attacks in Europe and panic over the Zika virus, we've got Yemen in a story that's virtually been unreported in the West. despite the fact that the Saudi-led coalition has launched a full-on attack and invasion of Yemen, we've got this group of militiamen, essentially, who are poorly armed, poorly trained. They have successfully defeated the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis, who are themselves backed by the United States in terms of intelligence and strategic assistance. But the Houthis have not only dealt a massive blow to coalition forces inside the country, but they've managed to inflict blows on the Saudis on their own territory. Now, we talked about part of this last week. There was a story that went virtually unreported in the West. The Houthis managed to wrest control of 3 Saudi military bases in Saudi Arabia's Jizan province, which is located near the border with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And they did that in January of this year. You haven't heard virtually any Western media outlets report this story, except if you count BrandonTurbeville.com and Activist Post and so forth. So they've managed to invade Syria and capture 3 military bases. The bases, Jabal al-Dud, al-Aril, and Madba, all of them seized by Houthi forces and their allies, the Allied Popular Committees. Now, in addition to that, the Houthis, along with Yemeni soldiers who are loyal to Saleh, they launched retaliatory strikes against Saudi Arabia inside Saudi Arabian territory, again, in the Najran region, southern Najran region, at the Al-Makrouk military base. And the Houthis and their allies have been inflicting heavy damage on Saudis and Saudi-led coalition troops and vehicles deployed on the ground inside Yemen. They've occasionally downed some coalition jets. The fighters have also managed to damage Saudi ships located off the coast. But here in July of this year, Houthi forces launched ballistic missiles into into Saudi Arabia. According to reports that are coming from Al-Madar, Houthis launched a Tochka ballistic missile toward the Al-Ahad al-Masariha military camp, which caused a heavy death toll of Saudi soldiers, as well as the destruction of several armored vehicles. I keep wanting to say Syria, I mean Saudi Arabia in this context. Now, we've got new reports that in addition to all of this, the Houthis have penetrated around 10 kilometers into Saudi Arabia. We've got video footage surfacing showing a battle between the Houthi forces, Saudi Arabia. The tanks of Saudi Arabia are obliterated by the Houthi fighters with these missiles. And again, 10 kilometers into Saudi Arabia. That's no joke. That's good news in the sense that the Saudis they have revealed themselves to be exactly what they are, which is a force of paper tigers, right? These guys are not equipped. They are essentially militarily worthless, and the scrappy band of rebels known as the Houthis are showing the world this fact. Now, if we look at the situation in Yemen, and we have to do this, we have to look at this as a positive light. The Saudi Arabians have been nothing but a force of evil and destabilization across the world. Even at home, there is no domestic tranquility. It's oppression. It is destruction. It is beheadings in the square, theocracy, police state, all of that, and low living standards, of course. So, while we express good wishes for the Saudi Arabian people, we also realize that the Saudis have to go, and they have to stop inflicting Wahhabism across the face of the planet. And this is a positive development that the Houthis are now able to mount a counterattack in this realm. And it's not just the counterattack, right? We've also got an announcement by Houthi leadership that a coalition forming a new political council that will govern Yemen and establish a new constitution is now in the works. And the council is supposed to be made up of Houthi fighters as well as individuals who are part of the forces who are loyal to the Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh, a former Yemeni president who was overthrown in the Arab Spring, Western-backed Arab Spring. That's another stated goal of the coalition. Their stated goal is to ensure the unity of Yemen. The Council has called upon all non-terrorist forces in Yemen to join and assist the unification of the country. The Saudis are, of course, outraged at the prospect that the Houthis and allied forces are not only rejecting their attempt to control them, but they're doing so successfully. We had Saudi Arabia's Council of Ministers on Monday, or this past Monday, reiterating that the agreement between the Houthis and followers of ousted President Ali Abdullah Saleh to form a political council in Yemen is an obstacle to reach a political agreement to end the suffering of the Yemeni people. The cabinet also said that they considered it a flagrant violation of the resolutions of the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2216, as well as the Gulf Cooperation Council's initiative and its executive mechanism, and the outcome of comprehensive national dialogue. And of course, the chair of that session, which took place at Al Salam Palace in Jeddah, was Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Naif. He's the Deputy Premier and Minister of Interior. Now, what's laughable about this is that Saudi Arabians are claiming that the council is an obstacle to a political solution in Yemen, but the council is by definition a political solution to the problems. And not only that, but there never would have been a crisis of this magnitude had Saudi Arabia and its coalition of monarchs not invaded the country to begin with. So I guess it should be clear to everybody that whenever one's enemy feels comfortable enough to announce the creation of a political process and a new governing structure that actively work toward that, it's often a sign that one's military campaign has failed. So it's time for the Saudi Arabians and their allies to cut their losses and withdraw from Yemen and leave Yemeni affairs to Yemenis. So we're in the way of solutions. What do we have as a solution for Yemen? Again, it is for the Saudi Arabians, the Qataris, the Emiratis to leave, to butt out, to get the hell out of Yemen. And as a result, the Yemenis can pull back from Saudi Arabian territory back into their own country. And again, the Saudi Arabians can get the hell out of Yemen. And the United States, for that matter, can butt out of Yemeni affairs. That's our solution. And of course, domestically, we would demand that the U.S. back off their destruction of Yemen, and of course demand that they engage in something like the Marshall Plan, basically an investment via a nationalized Federal Reserve for the rebuilding and the development of Yemen and Yemeni infrastructure, national government structure, and of course the development of civilian infrastructure, whether it's roads, whether it's transportation, other forms, clean water, water salination, or water treatment, the water delivery, essentially, clean water systems that if they exist, they should be improved and modernized and even made to reflect the 21st century, and if they don't exist, to make them exist. Of course, this would apply to electricity, the internet, all sources and all services that are necessary, medical, you name it. That's what we want to see, an investment in the development and modernization of Yemen. Of course, I should note, doing this not in blatant capitalist corporate development that regards nothing but profit as worthy of investment, but of course something that puts people and the environment over profit. So we could do this. We could have development, we could have economy, we could have high living standards at the same time as treating the planet as it should be treated. So we don't have to do this with toxic mercury spills. We can do this and make sure that the environment is protected and kept clean as well. And we'll get into that with the 43 points. Now, we also want to mention, again, let me go back to Syria, and this is kind of the domestic shift here, because this will bring us back to the United States. There is much discussion now, at least in the alternative media, about how much Hillary Clinton knew about the funding of terrorism and how it's related to Benghazi. Now, we've got rumors and accusations and scandals. All of these things are surrounding the 2013 Benghazi incident, where we had a number of U.S. ambassadorial staff, as well as Ambassador Chris Stevens, who were murdered by the Islamic extremists. The question almost always arises now, how much was known about Stevens' mission of supporting terrorists in Syria, and who knew it? Well, the discussion of how Stevens was killed, why he was killed, or if anybody knew what was going to happen to Stevens before it happened, is not really in the scope of what we want to focus on for this discussion. But the question of whether or not it was known that Stevens was essentially working as a conduit between terrorists in Libya and those in Syria, as well as a facilitator of arms to those terrorists in Syria, is well worth mentioning. Indeed, it's important to note that documents obtained by Judicial Watch from the Department of Defense and Department of State reveal that the Obama administration, as well as the State Department, meaning the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, were all well aware of the fact that weapons were being shipped to terrorists in Syria via Benghazi, Libya. And we have one document which was obtained from the Department of Defense, more specifically the Defense Intelligence Agency, dated October 2012. It stated clearly that not only were weapons being shipped to Syria, but that the shipments themselves were being monitored. Now, I'm going to read part of the documents, and you can determine for yourself what this means. We'll discuss it afterwards. Weapons from the former Libyan military stockpiles were shipped from the port of Benghazi, Libya, to the port of Banyas and the port of Borj Islam, Syria. The weapons shipped during late August 2012 were sniper rifles, RPGs, and 125mm and 155mm howitzers missiles. During the immediate aftermath of and following the uncertainty caused by the downfall of the Gaddafi regime in October 2011 and up until early September 2012, the weapons from the former Libya military stockpiles located in Benghazi, Libya, were shipped from the port of Benghazi, Libya, to the ports of Banyas and the port of Borj Islam, Syria. The Syrian ports were chosen due to the small amount of cargo traffic transiting these ports. The ships used to transport the weapons were medium-sized and able to hold 10 or less shipping containers of cargo. The weapons shipped from Syria during late August 2012 were sniper rifles, RPGs, 125, 155mm howitzer missiles. The numbers for each weapons were estimated to be 500 sniper rifles, 100 RPG launchers, 300 total rounds, and approximately 400 howitzer missiles, 200 each, 125, and 200 each, 155mm. So that is the document. Now, in 2016, the documents might not be considered bombshell information, and many alternative researchers and writers such as myself were condemned as tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists in 2012 for suggesting that the State Department and the Obama administration were complicit in and facilitating the arming of terrorists in Syria. But now that cannot be argued. In addition to that, the documents are a direct contradiction to the testimony of a number of American officials, including the cackling witch herself, Hillary Clinton, who claimed in sworn public testimony that the U.S. had no role in the arming and funding and support of Syrian terrorists early on in the Syrian crisis. Clinton herself claimed she had no knowledge of any program like this when she was questioned by Rand Paul at a congressional hearing back in 2013. And I wish I could play the interview for you, but but essentially this is Rand Paul says, "It has been in the news that ships have been leaving from Libya and they might have weapons. What I would like to know is the annex that was close by in Benghazi. Were they involved with procuring, buying, selling, obtaining weapons, and were any of these weapons being transferred to other countries, to any countries, Turkey included?" Hillary Clinton responds, "Senator, you'll have to direct that question to the agency that ran the annex. I will see what information is available." Rand Paul, "You're saying you don't know." Hillary Clinton, "I do not know. I don't have any information on that." So, the document didn't specify, of course, that the United States was a responsible party regarding the organizing the weapons shipments, or that it had a direct role in facilitating them. The responsible party in those documents is redacted, of course, but it does make clear that the United States was aware of and monitoring these shipments. At the very least, this proves that Hillary's testimony is false, and at worst, it adds to the pile of evidence that the United States was not only a supporter, but the architect of the Syrian crisis from day one. And I think that's very clear that that's exactly what we're seeing here. That this is just going to be added to the pile of evidence. Now, last word about Syria. I want to mention John McCain. All right, in 3.5 decades, the United States has come full circle in terms of its at least publicly stated strategy overseas. From the late 1970s, when the U.S. armed the Mujahideen rebels to draw in and fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, to 2016, when the U.S. but the U.S. is continuing to give Syrian, a.k.a. rebels, a.k.a. moderate terrorists, Tau missiles to shoot down Russian aircraft over Syria. The U.S. and Russia are now engaged in a proxy war, at least this time entirely at the impetus of the United States and its allies. And, of course, the people of the target nation are going to pay the ultimate price of this proxy war. Now, we recently had a Russian Mi-8 helicopter being shot down over Syria in the Idlib region, and the helicopter and its crew were on a humanitarian mission, even according to the pro-terrorist Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Even the SOHR couldn't argue that they weren't on a humanitarian mission. Western media outlets and think tanks are, of course, attempting to claim that the helicopter was on a combat mission, but nobody outside of NATO countries believes this. Nobody outside of NATO countries even gives this the time of day. These pro-war analysts produce evidence that's scant at best, just absolute deceit at worst. But it was a U.S. missile that brought down the helicopter, and that's been reported by the Japan Times being a Tau missile that was provided to these moderate terrorists by the United States. And these Tau missiles, of course, were supposed to be provided only to moderate terrorists who had been vetted by the U.S. State Department and kept out of the hands of extremists. Remember, we discussed part of this last week. But as myself and the New York Times have reported since the very beginning of the crisis, there was never anything resembling a moderate fighting in Syria. Indeed, the vetting process has revealed that the United States has not only armed but given Tau missiles to groups that are as bad, if not worse, than ISIS itself. For instance, the terrorist group Nur al-Din al-Zengi, or Zenki, however you want to say it, they recently beheaded a child. We covered that on the website and on this show. They did this on camera. That was actually considered a moderate vetted group. And John McCain, who's presumably pleased at the fact that this dream of his 80s is beginning to be repeated. Remember, McCain told Fox News, this is a quote, "I might do what we did in Afghanistan many years ago to give those guys the ability to shoot down those planes. That equipment is available." And then, of course, the Fox News host says, ask him who he meant to give the missiles to, and he says, "The Free Syrian Army, just like the Afghans shot down the Russians." McCain, of course, has long been a vocal supporter of terrorism in Syria and in Libya and beyond. He's supported virtually every war to cross his path during his tenure as senator, and he's actively covered up and stonewalled evidence that pointed to the possibility that American prisoners of war were still in Vietnam long after the war was over. Nevertheless, the United States is now finding itself publicly admitting to funding terrorists and terrorism, as well as attempting to represent these terrorists as freedom fighters. The major difference this time around is twofold. First, the alternative media, to our credit, has provided a significant roadblock to the impunity with the United States government has acted in Syria by the deconstruction and competition that we've provided with the State Department's narratives. We've actually had a relatively moderate effect on the way that the Syrian war is being presented now, as opposed to the way it was being presented before, and that is a good thing. We need to continue to fight those narratives. Second, Russia is no longer an empire in decline. Back in the late 1970s, the Soviet Union was a superpower, but it was one who was rapidly declining. In fact, today, the superpower is rising. Russia is rising, and it's the United States that's in decline. So for these reasons, the moral reasons, the strategic reasons, the reasons of self-preservation, the United States needs to abandon its foolish policies of empire and also abandon the advice of fools like John McCain. So that would be a vast improvement in U.S. strategy. Now, as I promised, we will move out of the Middle East now, and we will move to Western Europe. There is a new campaign against pet homeopathy in the UK. The mainstream media and the medical establishment in the UK has now discovered this potentially deadly threat to pets and animals in the UK, but that, of course, is not a fast-spreading disease. It's not the destruction of the natural habitat of many animals, the fact that England has cut down so many of their trees. Or is it tainted food? No, of course not. It is pet homeopathy. That's the frightening threat to animals all across the United Kingdom. So we've got reports by the Daily Mail that over 2,500 vets, veterinary nurses, scientists, animal lovers have signed a petition to the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons demanding that it blacklist homeopathy. Of course, this is the appeal to authority, the vets, veterinary nurses, scientists, animal lovers. Well, Hitler was an animal lover. I guess, would that count? I guess, whatever. The appeal to authority is always false in this sense. But homeopathy, for those of you who don't know, in the UK, it's practiced by around only 50 vets in the UK, but they're fully qualified veterinary surgeons who simply offer the treatments in addition to conventional options. The petition signers warned that homeopathy is dangerous, and they claim to fear for the well-being of pets who are treated with the alternative therapy as opposed to conventional medicine. We've got a vet, Danny Chambers from Devon. He says, quote, "The health of animals is totally in the hands of those charged with their care. It is unethical to inflict ineffective alternatives on creatures that have no choice in the matter," end quote. So that in a nutshell is the argument being made by the people in the UK who are on a crusade to blacklist homeopathy. But there remains an interesting question that needs to be asked to the signatories of this petition. And this applies over here to the U.S. too, is if homeopathic remedies are ineffective, and they're basically just a placebo, why are they so dangerous? It's certainly true that treatments can be both ineffective and unsafe. We can look at vaccines to stand as a prime example of that. But the anti-homeos seem to be arguing that something they consider to be the equivalent of a sugar pill is also somehow dangerous. Other ones are arguing that homeopathy might not be dangerous in and of itself. It's dangerous when used in place of conventional treatments. Of course, Mr. Danny Chambers would never argue that the litany of drugs that are given to animals should be blacklisted because of their side effects, only when there is a perceived albeit admittedly indirect danger presented by natural remedies, does Chambers argue for any kind of ban. So that's very interesting. Chambers may not necessarily agree with homeopathy or acknowledge that it has positive results, but he's still engaging in a jihad against the rights of pet owners who might seek a treatment that doesn't involve the possibility of liver failure or seizure or death. In other words, if Chambers doesn't approve of a treatment, it should be banned, plain and simple. And that is the fundamentalist, radical, fanatical nature of these people. If Danny Chambers believes that people are too stupid to make the right decision, all other options should be eliminated. Now, I have to say Theresa May might not be the greatest choice for Prime Minister, but woe unto the people of England if Danny Chambers is ever placed into that position. One thing's for sure, the English dinner menu would be a lot shorter because it would only contain a list of the foods that Danny Chambers likes and approves of. Opposition parties obviously would be eliminated. Votes would only be cast if they were for Danny Chambers. Danny Chambers would win the election 100%. This is the kind of the logical direction in which his claims and his demands are leading you, right? So thankfully, at least right now, Chambers is relegated to obscurity. He's got to deal with the daily grind and sign pre-written letters to veterinary organizations, and that's about all that his life is ever going to accomplish. But what is interesting about Chambers' argument regarding the ethics of inflicting ineffective alternatives on animals that have no choice in the matter is that he doesn't apply this logic to horse-drawn carriages, to circus animals, or to animal test subjects. Where are his letters to those organizations? It's a vast difference between treating an animal with a therapeutic method that's ineffective at worst and then torturing them until they perform tricks or produce a biological response for your curiosity. So the answer to that question, of course, we should say that to Chambers, Danny Chambers, the homeopathy is the equivalent of animal cruelty. But again, he says nothing about the instances of real animal cruelty mentioned above. Horses don't come into the world dreaming of the day they drag some drunken and fat sightseer slowly through the streets of London filled with traffic and pollution. No dog wakes up in the morning feeling unfulfilled that his scientific career is not being realized because he's not having chemicals dropped into his eyes as he is restrained. Are we to assume that Chambers truly believes this is an animal's choice, or are we to believe that his concern for animals is simply selective and based on his pocketbook more than anything else? And the answer to that question is relatively clear. But obviously this alleged concern for animals is not only selective, but it's just the latest attack on natural medicines and individual choice in a long campaign by pharmaceutical and medical industrial corporations that are dragging their media outlets along behind them. So speaking of natural supplements, I want to draw your attention to this article that is on BrandonTurbeville.com regarding echinacea. Now, might not be the most pressing issue. Listeners might be wondering why I'm bringing this up, but we are now, myself and Heather Callahan of Natural Blaze, are putting out a series of articles. Now, it's not guaranteed that these articles will be coming out every week or every month, but they will be coming out. We're not putting ourselves on any time scale here, but it's going to be focused on individual natural health supplements and what they can do in terms of what they can prevent, what they can help treat, and so forth. And of course, I should probably protect myself by saying I'm not a doctor, and if you have any questions, go check with your doctor and see if your doctor gives you permission to consume a natural supplement, or you couldn't, or just go research it yourself and make your own decision. That's what I would encourage you to do. Of course, check with your doctor. they have their place. Medical doctors have their place. Naturopaths have their place. I have always argued for a balance in that sense, but I don't like the idea. The medical profession, of course, is so closely connected with the police and law enforcement professions now that I think the massive ego that's often found in the medical profession is now mixing with the authoritarianism of the law enforcement profession, and now it's getting it's too much, right? So these are supplements that could help you with many different things, and this is not the typical alternative media natural health website stuff, right? This is not going to be, echinacea cures cancer and Ebola and, all these types of blood spurting diseases. Just go to the store, buy some echinacea, and you'll be fine. There is, on the other side, a lot of disinformation, quite frankly, and it can be dangerous to people who don't have the right information. So again, don't just go to a natural health website and believe everything that you see there. Don't believe the medical doctors on everything, and don't believe the natural doctors on everything, or the natural websites on everything. Go do your own research, and that's what we're trying to provide, is the ability for you to do that in a much easier fashion. So basically, the article, Echinacea helps with anxiety and these 22 other issues. If you go look at the article, you've got each one of those issues listed, and we have links to scientific studies. Now, that is not all of the scientific studies that have been conducted regarding the supplement and the issue that they are connected to and that they improve, but they are a study, at least one study, that shows that they do have some significant effects on those illnesses. For instance, echinacea, there is a study. It's being recognized in the health magazines for its effects on anxiety. We've had more research coming out that has revealed that echinacea does contain anti-anxiety properties. And all you have to do is click on the link, and that'll take you to the scientific study and tell you about those products. So all of that there is available in one article, and it's a good starting off point. If you're interested in a supplement, you think it might help with a specific issue, then simply go to the article and check it out and see if you see any evidence for it. And that's a good jumping off point for you to go take a look and see what the research-based evidence that this is successful. Now, there's some other things that it might be successful with that don't necessarily have much study or any evidence, and that's listed in a separate area in the article. So please check that out. I encourage everybody to start taking control of their own health. Again, you can't trust the medical doctors on everything, but they do have their place. You can't trust the natural health community on everything, but it certainly has its place as well. And we have to approach this with a balance and an open but certainly critical mind if you want to get somewhere with this. Now, back to the United States. I guess we should talk about the Zika panic. We have state and local officials in Florida going door to door asking residents for urine samples and other information as a result of the alleged local transmission of the Zika virus. According to CNN, this may have increased since I wrote the article about it, but as I haven't gone back to look it up since August 1st, I do believe they're saying there's been other transmission. But according to CNN on August 1st, 4 individuals located in Miami-Dade and Broward counties have been infected with the Zika virus as a result of local mosquitoes. And these are the first known cases of Zika transmission by mosquitoes in the continental U.S. So there's no treatment or vaccine for Zika virus, and the officials believe that the transmission is confined to a single zip code, an area north of downtown Miami. Despite the fact that there have been 386 cases of Zika in Florida, the mainstream media and the health officials are treating this new transmission as a cause for potential panic. It's also possible that somebody could have Zika without actually knowing. Around 80% of the people who have the virus don't show any symptoms at all. For the other 20%, those symptoms can include, get this, joint pain, red eyes, rash, fever, which can last from a few days to a week. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not Ebola. This is not the stand. All right, this is essentially the flu at worst, bad allergies at best. Well, at best, you don't even know you have it. But this sounds like if you show symptoms, it feels like allergies to the flu. It's not the type of disease that mass martial law and quarantine and the police state should be involved in. I wouldn't argue for that in any event, but this certainly is not something calling for all the panic. If the officials in Florida are really concerned about the spread of Zika, they would attack the virus at its greatest weakness, which is high living standards, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute. But I want to break down some of the history of this, right? As Zika went from its first discovered case back in 1947 and a few sporadic appearances up until last year, the virus is now an outbreak stage as the World Health officials are concerned that it might become a pandemic. I think it is now officially a pandemic, I believe, but don't quote me on that specifically. World Health researchers are claiming to be perplexed as to the beginning of this virus, or at least the sudden appearance and rapid spread of it starting in 2015. There have been articles that have discussed this connection before. I've done these articles back in 2011 regarding the mosquitoes, the types of mosquitoes. Oxitec first unveiled a large-scale genetically modified mosquito farm in Brazil in July 2012, and their goal was reducing the incidence of dengue fever. And dengue fever is spread by the same type of mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti, and the same mosquitoes that spread the Zika virus. And they can't fly more than 400 meters. The World Health Organization says it may inadvertently be transported to humans from one place, or by humans to one place to the other. And in July 2015, shortly after the genetically modified mosquitoes were first released into the wild in Juazeiro, Brazil, Oxitec announced that they had successfully controlled the Aedes aegypti mosquito that spreads dengue fever, chikungunya, and Zika virus by reducing the target population by more than 90%. Now, that sounds like success, but there's another possibility to consider. There's the possibility that the effects of this program could have backfired. The mosquitoes that were released by Oxitec, these are OX513A, these were genetically engineered to need the presence of tetracycline in order to survive maturity. Outside the presence of tetracycline, they die. The idea behind the GM mosquitoes was they would be released into the wild and they would mate with the natural female mosquitoes because only the males were modified. And the offspring that result are also supposed to die without the presence of tetracycline in their system. The GM mosquito program was introduced under the guise of controlling disease-carrying mosquito populations to reduce the amount of diseases in humans that were spread by mosquitoes, obviously. So there's a massive problem with this program, and most notably is the fact that the presence of tetracycline in the environment is not as rare as you might suspect, particularly in places like Brazil. We have an unclassified document from the Trade and Agricultural Directorate Committee for Agriculture, dated February 2015. Brazil is the third largest in global antimicrobial consumption and food animal production, meaning that Brazil is third in the world for the use of tetracycline in food animals. And as a study by the American Society of Agronomy explained, quote, it is estimated that approximately 75% of antibiotics are not absorbed by animals and are excreted in waste. One of the antibiotics or antimicrobials that is specifically named in that report for its environmental persistence is tetracycline. Back in September 2010, Dr. Ricarda A. Steinbrecher wrote a report in which he stated that there is a known survival rate of 3 to 4% of the GM mosquitoes. He suggested that further studies should be conducted before they were released in the environment. In fact, a confidential internal Oxitec document that was revealed in 2012 revealed that the survival rate could be as high as 15%, even with very low levels of tetracycline present. Even small amount, this is what it says, even small amounts of tetracycline can repress the engineered lethality. And then they describe the 15% survival rate. They say, quote, after a lot of testing and comparing experimental design, it was found that researchers had used a cat food to feed the OX513A larva, and this cat food contained chicken. It is known that tetracycline is routinely used to prevent infections in chickens, especially in the cheap mass-produced chicken used for animal food. The chicken is heat-treated before being used, but this does not remove all the tetracycline. This means that a small amount of tetracycline was being added from the food to the larva and repressing the designed lethal system, end quote. So even absent the tetracycline, the doctor I mentioned above, Ricarda A. Steinbrecher, explained a subpopulation of genetically modified Aedes mosquitoes could theoretically develop and thrive in theory, capable of surviving and flourishing despite any further releases of pure GM mosquitoes which still have that gene intact. She added the effectiveness of the system also depends on the genetically designed late onset of lethality. If the time of onset is altered due to environmental conditions, then a 3 to 4% survival rate represents a much bigger problem. Okay, so there's even more problems with the process of releasing GM mosquitoes into the environment. And we have another risk associated with the Oxitec experiment is the potential for the release of genetically engineered biting females into the environment. Since female mosquitoes are the mosquitoes which bite humans, Oxitec is claiming that its GE mosquito population is sort of, that it's all male, but the method that they're using by which the mosquitoes are being sorted, the potential for a release of female mosquitoes is very real. We have Eric Hoffman saying, quote, the sorting is conducted by hand and could result in up to 0.5% of the released insects being female. This would raise new health concerns as people could be hit by GE mosquitoes. It could also hamper efforts to limit the spread of dengue fever, end quote. So it should be noted also that the eradicating of the Aedes aegypti type of mosquito might leave the area open to invasion by other species of mosquito. Remember, when you do things like this in the environment, it also often has unforeseen but tragic effects. The Asian tiger mosquito, for instance, considered one of the most invasive species in the world, is known to be a carrier of both dengue fever and West Nile virus. And what would be the result of an Asian tiger mosquito invasion into South Florida? An eradication of Aedes aegypti might well provide us with the answer. Now, while many people might be concerned about the spread of the Zika virus from places like Africa and Brazil to the Western world and beyond, or that the virus will become an epidemic in the places it currently is at, many Americans might be surprised to learn that the GM mosquitoes are slated to be released inside the United States. In December 2011, I wrote an article entitled Releasing Genetically Engineered Mosquitoes Poses Unknown Risk to Florida, where I documented the Oxitec plans to release 5,000 to 10,000 GM mosquitoes near the Florida Keys. This program was presented to the public under the guise of an attempt to eradicate dengue fever, and it's still awaiting approval from regulatory agencies despite widespread opposition from the public. So if it's true that there's a link between the GM mosquitoes and Zika virus, then Florida might soon be covered in ticking time bombs over its swamps, waiting to provide us yet with another public health emergency. So the program itself, in the time that I've got, I want to go over some of this, is older than that. In 2009, Also, under the guise of preventing the spread of dengue fever, GM mosquitoes were released by Oxitec in the Cayman Islands. In fact, it is this release that has many people questioning whether or not the GM mosquitoes actually have a link to increased rates of dengue fever. After all, shortly after the release of the GM mosquitoes in the Caymans, cases of dengue fever in Florida doubled. Is it really a coincidence that cases of dengue fever increased shortly after millions of mosquitoes capable of carrying the fever were released miles away in the Cayman Islands? Now, dengue fever had been eradicated in terms of naturally occurring outbreaks in the United States. Cases that were research-related and laboratory-generated have occurred here for many years. In fact, this is because the dengue fever has been of particular interest to the United States government, U.S. Army, and the CIA since at least the middle part of the 20th century. There's a great deal of evidence suggesting that the biochemical research facilities at Fort Detrick were conducting tests on dengue fever as a bioweapon as far back as 1942. It's generally known that in the 1950s, the CIA partnered with Fort Detrick to study dengue fever and other exotic diseases for use as biological weapons, and that is, again, it's generally known out there in the public view. According to the CIA documents, as well as a 1975 congressional committee, the three locations of Key West, Panama City, and Avon Park, two other locations in Central Florida, were testing sites for dengue research and dengue fever research. As it is generally the case, of course, the experiments at Avon Park were concentrated in low-income areas. These are predominantly black areas, projects. And according to H.P. Albarelli Jr. and Joe Martell of Truthout, it's a credible news source, we have CIA documents related to the MK Ultra, MK Naomi program, revealing that the agency was using the Aedes aegypti type of mosquito in these experiments also. In fact, in one of these experiments, 600,000 mosquitoes were released over Avon Park, and in another one, there was 150,000 mosquitoes released in specifically designed paper bags that were designed to open up when they hit the ground. Now, the Truthout magazine interviewed residents or test subjects of Avon Park who were still living in the area who related that there were at least 6 or 7 deaths resulting from the experiments. One resident said, quote, "Nobody knew what had gone on here for years, maybe over 20 years, but in looking back, it explained why a bunch of healthy people got sick quick and died at the time of those experiments," end quote. So around the same time of the Avon Park experiments, there were at least 2 cases of dengue fever reported among civilian researchers at Fort Detrick in Maryland. And I really want to go into this, and as usual, we've run out of time that we can't go into it fully. Next week, I want to stick with some domestic issues. Maybe next week we'll focus on the domestic issue, because I think we need to really get into the election system, the election that's taking place, talk about some good news that we've had in terms of medical marijuana and marijuana freedom in general. And we need to talk about marching orders. Well, we'll talk a bit about the news, but we're going to talk about our marching orders and what we need to do in order to have an even bigger change, an even bigger effect on the American landscape. And, of course, the landscape across the world. We have listeners in Europe and Africa and the Middle East and Asia as well. Listeners all over the world as well.
The Anti-Media Radio with your host Nick Burnaby here on UCY.tv.